Good evening, everyone. Come on, good evening, everyone. Much better. Welcome. We're glad that you're here. My name is Andrew Westover, and I'm the Eleanor McDonald Storza Deputy Director for Learning and Civic Engagement here at the High Museum of Art. I want to thank you for joining us for this evening's Driskell Conversation, featuring Naomi Beckwith, Deputy Director, and Jennifer and David Stockman, Chief Curator of the Guggenheim Museum, and Katherine Jentleson, the High's Senior Curator of American Art, and Merrie and Dan Boone, Curator of Folk and Self-Taught Art. I want to especially thank High Museum members in attendance. Your support is invaluable and fuels our mission. If you are not yet a member of the museum, or need to renew, please visit high.org at the end of this program. Also, thank you to the full High team for their essential support to make this program happen. Tonight's program, as you're probably aware, is in conjunction with the Driskell Prize. Established by the High Museum of Art in 2005, the David C. Driskell Prize in African American art and art history recognizes field-defining contributions to African American art by leading scholars and artists from across the country. Named in honor of the late artist and scholar David C. Driskell, this prize is the first prize in the country to recognize the importance of African American art. Acknowledging Driskell's own extraordinary gifts as both a historian and an artist, the prize annually alternates between awarding a practicing US-based African American artist and an art historian whose artistic practice or scholarly work makes an original and important contribution to the visual arts and study of African American art. The recipient of the prize receives $50,000 in unrestricted funds to use towards the furthering of their research or artistic practice. We are excited to have this moment to celebrate the 2024 Driskell Prize recipient, Naomi Beckwith, and hear directly from her about her current work. At the end of tonight's conversation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. You can submit your questions by scanning the QR code, which will pop up on the screen. Actually, I believe you saw it earlier, and it will return periodically. When you see that QR code, use your phone, take a quick picture, scan it. It will link you directly to a field where you can type questions for our speakers to answer. You've already seen their bios online and on the screen, so I'll simply say now that we are honored and excited to hear from two luminaries this evening. Please join me in welcoming Naomi Beckwith and Katherine Jentleson.
All right. Welcome back to Atlanta, Naomi.
Thank you so much, Katie. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out this evening.
Yeah, it's good to see all of you here. And, you know, as Andrew explained in his introduction, Naomi is the honoree of one of the most important prizes honoring contemporary artists and art historians and scholars across the United States, the David C. Driskell Prize. And I wanted to start tonight by asking you to kind of revisit some comments that I was lucky enough to hear you make a few weeks ago about David C. Driskell and about his kind of pioneering example, both as an artist and a scholar and historian. And one of the things that kind of stuck with me from what you said at this previous conversation was about the fact that he was someone who didn't just kind of go back into history and insert artists of African descent who had been previously excluded. He really rewrote history around artists of African descent. Yeah. And so I would love for you to share with this audience a little of your own kind of thoughts about his legacy and what he means to you.
Well, I think you just encapsulated that. I can't remember my absolute comments, but first of all, thank you so much for having me here. I just want this museum and, of course, the jury, those who sort of select the Driskell Prize, to know how incredibly grateful I am to have been selected for this prize, which I really did not think would ever happen. It was, for me, a shock, a beautiful shock. But part of the reason it was a beautiful shock is because I knew, of course, not only of the prize winners who came before me, but of course of the legacy that David Driskell left, and a legacy that he was already forming even in his lifetime. And I think you're absolutely right that Dr. Driskell was someone who understood the beauty of art history, the way it's taught in the most normal academic ways in the sort of majority institution. And it's beautiful to be able to like waltz through a mostly European-based history. But he also knew that these stories didn't have Black people in it because people didn't know about Black people. But he knew that the methodologies of the ways in which these stories were told necessarily excluded Black stories and African stories. And so he realized that you didn't just need a new ending to the fairy tale. Right? What you needed was a different framework altogether. So what does it mean if we tell art history, let's say, less about, I don't know, the development of egg tempera to oil painting, but what if we told art history through, let's say, a practice of ritual, or a practice of found object history, or a practice of community building? And when you take those different parameters, then you get different people inside of those stories. And so I think the amazing example that Dr. Driskell left was that you don't tell new stories, you give new frameworks altogether for a different tale. And he was, of course, an incredibly committed scholar, deeply, deeply committed to research.
And that also kind of brings us to the show that you recently opened at the Guggenheim in New York about Rashid Johnson, who is also somebody who is really working through, against, across histories in ways that are opening totally new kinds of trajectories in his own work, right? And so I wanted to talk for a while about this show, which I was lucky to see. And if you all get to New York anytime between now and it closes in late fall, or?
Oh, it closes at the top of next year, so you've got some time.
So you have time.
No, you don't, actually. Get there as soon as possible, but.
You never know what can happen. Yeah, it's an incredible show. And I, as you will continue to hear tonight, admire it in so many different ways. But one thing that really I loved as a fellow curator, is the text, okay? And we talked a little bit about this earlier, but the text for this show, if you go, leave yourself enough time to read all of the labels, all of the section texts, because they are really well written. And Rashid Johnson is an artist who, his work has so many layers, so you kind of need the guide and the interpretation of experts like Naomi. And I just wanted to read the opening line of the intro text because I thought it was so appropriate for this occasion. It reads, Rashid Johnson believes that a person is a product of the time in which they live, but in his art, he is most interested in examining the many ways in which an individual can shift or even escape sweeping historical forces. I loved that. I thought it resonated throughout the show, and I wanted you to maybe tell the audience a little bit about what it means to you for an artist to escape historical forces.
So thank you for that commentary. No one walks out of an exhibition saying, I love the text. I mean, that's...
Only curators.
So that's high praise, first of all. So maybe I'll tell a little bit of an anecdote about the world that Rashid and I grew up in, because that's really where that line comes from. So Rashid and I are both born in the 70s, mid-late 70s. We're both born to a set of parents who are deeply committed to Black education and Black liberation. So I went to a school, for instance, that we sort of said the Pledge of Allegiance every day, but then followed up with the Black National Anthem. And we were just inculcated with like Black history. That was just the core of our education. And that was, true for both of us. I think I wrote an essay years ago calling us both post-Black power babies. So there was no way in which we could not exist in the world without this deep sense of history sort of trailing us at all times. And it wasn't just a history of you've had these incredible forebears and ancestors sort of carving a way for you. I mean, I think, especially for someone like Rashid, who's ambitious, it also brought up the question of, how do I stand up to those forebears and those ancestors? What kind of legacy do I leave, given the fact that so many have done so much and against incredible odds before me? And so the question really is, you know, what do you do with those odds? Right. And Rashid's early work, as is the case with a lot of artists, deals with these historic figures. You see a lot of quotes of Du Bois. You see a lot of quotes of Frederick Douglass, even if not literary quotes, but you kind of see the references there, these large historical figures. And I think the question always for every artist is, how do you take what you've inherited and then use your singular voice and vision onto the world and create something new? And if you cannot, then you're a failed artist. But I think that the fact that Rashid has this exhibition shows that he's found a way to work with that material and his sense of history.
Absolutely, and this gets to something that you also kind of framed within the show, that he's a citational artist, right? He's this artist who has a citational practice. He is kind of metabolizing and transforming all of these kinds of historical and art historical influences. And these are a few of the works that kind of stopped me in my tracks when I was going through the show, just because of like all of the layers that he was unpacking as he was making, and then rebuilding, like as he was making these works. So I would love for you to talk about them, or really any of the other pieces from the show that you think really demonstrate this, again, like ability to just absorb, transform, and create something new that he has.
Yeah, it's a real generational thing, the way Rashid works in that citational way. And just to be clear, that term I actually take from Sampada Aranque, the writer and art historian. But I rephrase it and say, basically, he's part of the hip-hop generation, right? What did you do if you were born in the late 70s, but hey, listen to hip-hop for most of your life? But secondly, absorb the ability of hip-hop to do exactly what you said. Take all these references and remix, recode them, you know, make a montage out of them. It is absolutely the way I think he had learned to deal with culture, which is take the fragments that are useful and make something new from it. And you're right that there's some great examples in the exhibition. I mean, if you're looking at the work, I think it's to your left, these two sleds. I always stop there in the tours and talk about the ways in which this is a sort of triple, quadruple level of citations in Rashid's work. So there are two sleds that live as these kind of, I mean, not to be too dark, but Rashid calls them almost cadavers. And these come from a series of works that Rashid was making when he was literally just throwing things out of windows. Crazy. Just throwing stuff out of windows. And there's a video where you just see him throwing stuff out of windows. Now, that already is a kind of citation. It's a citation of Marcel Duchamp, one of the greatest conceptual artists of the 20th century, someone who kind of kicked off postmodernism in the US. But Marcel Duchamp was actually just dropping strings out of windows, things that don't kill people. But Rashid, very specifically, were choosing specific types of objects to throw out of windows. And in this case, he's throwing sleds, which are a reference to Joseph Beuys, the German artist who sort of made his reputation in the post-war period, post-World War II period, sort of creating this fiction and fable about himself as someone who was shot down over Siberia by the Russians when he was in the German Luftwaffe and almost died, but his life was saved by these native Siberians who then wrapped him in fat and then or I should say salved him in fat, rubbed his body with fat, and then wrapped that with felt. And so felt and fat become these materials that Joseph Beuys works with for the rest of his life. But he also talks about, after he'd been sort of wrapped in this cloth, they laid him on the shed and then on these sleds, and then took him to huts for safety. So the sleds also are another material that shows up. So there is now Duchamp and then Beuys, But the title of that work is Homage to Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart. And of course, things fall apart because Rashid's been throwing them out the window, and instead of really foregrounding the way he's quoting, let's say, these European artists, in fact, he wants to foreground an African writer. And so again, it becomes his kind of hip-hop-esque way of doing these multiple layers of citation. On the right, the 3 beautiful monochrome works are part of this series called Cosmic Slops. And I really consider this series the pivot for Rashid from a kind of less mature to a more mature practice. And that pivot comes when he starts working with signature materials like Joseph Beuys did. And again, as a post-Black Power baby, it was really important for our parents and then us to basically use grooming materials that come from the motherland. And in this case, shea butter and black soap. I still use these every day. Rashid still uses these things. And those things were part of course, his ritual daily care, but they also become artistic materials for him. So those things that look like monochrome paintings, that look like they're part of the American abstract expressionist sort of period, are actually, in fact, melted black soap mixed with wax that he's dropped on these canvases. And so it kind of gives you a sense of painting, it gives you a sense of art history, but it's really about the self-care of Black bodies turned into art.
And these practices of self-care, right, are really foregrounded in so much of what he's doing, and also kind of lead, as does this discussion of hip-hop, to the next kind of point, right, which is where the show's title comes from. And Rashid, part of the show too, he presents entire like segments of libraries on palettes. He's a bibliophile, clearly, like a very literary person reading, fiction, nonfiction, poetry, all of these things. And so I wanted to pause and talk about this poem by Merrie Baraka that was the inspiration for the title of the show, but also for other kinds of threads you're weaving throughout it. And we talked before about you maybe reading this short excerpt, although I'm happy to do it as well.
You know, I would love to read it, but you might have to because Naomi did not bring her glasses on stage.
Right.
And Naomi's aging, and so
okay, I got you. Sorry. Okay, so it's skymen dancing and the skymen stumbling till they get the sun out. Their eyes and integrate the in-head movie show with the material reality that exists with and without them. And this is from a much longer poem called A Poem for Deep Thinkers that Baraka wrote in 1977. So will you tell us a little bit about the choice to foreground this poem in this way and use it as the title of the show?
Yes, I would start with talking about maybe multiple levels, foregrounding poetry, foregrounding Baraka, and then this poem in particular. So why poetry? So you're right, Rashid is utterly, utterly literate. And in fact, there's a wonderful work in the show called The Reader that is literally him with a book and a scotch in a garden in Paris. Rashid's also the son of a poet. His mother's a poet, and they've done amazing sort of collaborations together. But Rashid is also deeply interested in the legacy of poetry, especially in its sort of public life in America. We know there are brilliant, brilliant Black poets throughout history. You've got Zora Neale Hurston, who shows up in his work, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Gwendolyn Brooks, who also is a frequent reference. But there is a sense, I think, that Rashid and I both share, that the riches of Black poetry is not so as well known as, let's say, the riches of the music tradition. So if I say we're part of the hip-hop generation, I mean, most people in this audience kind of understand what that means, even if they can't name a whole album, right? But no one can really maybe talk through the development of Black poetry. And so it's been really important for Rashid to foreground poetry as a kind of form of Black genius. In particular, he's interested in Amiri Baraka because Baraka, for multiple reasons. First of all, he likes a joke that Amiri Baraka, who was born Leroy Jones, changed his name so that Leroy Jones would never die. He's like, there's no gravestone in the world that has Leroy Jones's name on it. But Baraka was someone who came through the beat poetry tradition, a very studied and deliberate literary figure who was also, of course, deeply invested in this quest for Black liberation. Right? He was one of the founders of the Black arts movement and was interested in that intersection and the responsibility of artists to society, but also tried to balance them in many ways. And these are questions, again, that Rashid is asking as someone who believes that everyone is a product of history. What is my responsibility to my art? And what is my responsibility to the world in which I live? And is there a way that those things shouldn't be pulling at or against each other, but need to be integrated? And Baraka, I think, really posed those questions so specifically, which is why he's also a constant reference for Baraka. There is a line, again, I can't quite see it, but there's a point where the poem talks about the skymen getting the sun out of their eyes. And Rashid was raised in a household that wasn't particularly religious. In fact, he called his father a committed atheist, like a deeply, deeply evangelical atheist. But like most artists, he's also thinking about a sense of the metaphysics. And one of the things that he says is the closest thing he has to a sense of God is that sensation you get when you close your eyes and you turn your face to the sun. I can do it with this light now. And what you get is this beautiful red sheen as the light comes through your blood vessels. It's like that for him is God. That kind of movement of a sensory condition through the body toward nature. And that red is also a big part of the exhibition. And so he was clearly thinking also about this poem, about these kind of characters with the sun in their eyes as we're making the exhibition.
So how perfect is it that you had this architecture to present, those kinds of experiences where you can literally look up through the skylights and see the sun, and it affects, everything that's in the show all day long, and you've done this incredible work of suspending all of these living plants from the ceilings, from what are they even hung from? I don't really know.
They're hung from right under that sort of skylight.
Yeah, but you can't, when you're there, it looks like they're just floating. So it's a very otherworldly type of experience, maybe not unlike what Rashid's talking about with closing your eyes and looking up at the sun and feeling close to God or close to that kind of experience. And I love, too, with the show, it wasn't just the way that you use the atrium, but when you all go get to see it, you'll notice that there's a wonderful rhythm as you're going up the ramps of the museum. You're not presented with, this is this body of work from Rashid, and this is this body of work. You don't kind of move through his career because he's an artist who works in video, and he works in sculpture and painting and all kinds of different practices. You're kind of in this eternal return of always reconnecting with different ways that he works. And then the last thing I'm showing on this slide is this funny thing that you did, I think, where when you're at the top of the ramp and you kind of wander and you're no longer really in the show, you put this work no mas. So, yay, curator humor. But anyway, I would love for you to talk a little bit about the kind of opportunities and challenges of working with something like the Frank Lloyd Wright architectural masterpiece that you have at your disposal, and the choices that you made for how and where to present his work.
Yeah, you're very kind to say that the architecture is perfect for the show, but the truth of the matter is, I believe that all architecture is perfect, right? What you have to do is find a way to make your story inside the envelope that you have. And this building doesn't work for all artists, right? There are artists who I refuse to show there. They will beg. And artists who know who we are showing, but we won't show in this grand space because it just does not work for their art. So you really have to marry those things. This building is a spiral, a literal spiral. It is one that you start from the bottom and you work your way up. And we wanted to really do this show that was kind of thematic, that we wanted to do that. Here's this body of work, or here's this concern, followed by another. But when you have the spiral where you can kind of see all the details from beginning to end, it kind of forces you into more of a chronological story. So it is loosely chronologically hung, but you're right that because the entirety of the building being an atrium is visible from top to bottom, you're always aware of relationships. And so where we place things on that timeline become really, really, really important. I'm gonna talk about the challenges of working in that building.
No, you want to talk about the challenges? Or you
Oh,
don't?
yeah.
Okay, yeah, I want you to. Yeah.
Okay, so, I mean, Rashid and I like to joke, I shouldn't say this in public, but, but Rashid and I like to joke that Frank Lloyd Wright hates artists. Like, first of all, the whole thing is a ramp, you're right, it's a ramp, which means there are no straight lines in the entire building, right? The entire building is slanted, one. And not only that, the walls are concave. So there are no straight walls in the building either. And then on top of that, though there are spaces where we have these really tall works that are kind of, seen from floor to ceiling, the truth of the matter is that the building is sort of separated in what we call bays. They look almost like these individual sections. And the bays tend to have what we call kick plates, or this kind of slope that goes up to the wall. So the height of most walls is about like 4 feet. Basically. So we really had to build out all these false walls that pulled the architecture forward to hang these large works for Rashid. And we won't even get to the fact that like half of his works weigh like 400 pounds and up. And so then we had to build all these braces and brackets and do all this work with engineers. I mean, it was a lot. It was a lot of back-end work, but you do that to make it look effortless and to make it look like everything's floating. But the most important thing I think that happened in working with this building is that Rashid came every Sunday to the building. I mean, he came to my office every week anyway, as we were kind of mapping out the show and working with the models and reworking the order of things. But he would walk from his house downtown all the way uptown, through the park uptown every Sunday. And then he would walk the ramps to get a sense of what it meant to dance with the building and to understand what it means for his art to live in the building, and also to watch people and their behavior, how people kind of engage with art in the building. And so even though I'd like to say that as a curator I had all this intention in the way that, that this show is seen, this was really a long-standing conversation with someone who was deeply, deeply dedicated to like the behavior of this architecture and how his work could live in it.
Wow. That must have been a very interesting and iterative kind of journey to be on together. And
it made every Sunday night real interesting. I would like wait by the phone, literally, like he's gonna call and have an idea, a new idea. We got to change everything, and the book's already gone to print, and he wants to like do something. And that did happen, but it's still a wonderful process.
yeah, no, it's got to be amazing to have a thought partner who created the work and then it also is so invested in movement, as you said, and the body and space and those sorts of things. So. I hate to move on from the show, but you're incredibly prolific is another kind of topic of conversation tonight. It's kind of ridiculous. You have another show that just opened that's part of a new kind of newish initiative, right, at the Guggenheim to work with its incredible collection and do collection-focused exhibitions. So this is a collection and focus show featuring as its kind of nucleus, Faith Ringgold's Tar Beach, one of her most important works. And you're doing the thing that we were talking about before with David Driskell of putting this work into conversation with her many influences, with artists who have gone on to be inspired by her. Can you tell a little about who's in the show and your thought process?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, first of all, apologies to the institution because I know you're also doing a Faith Ringgold show and you requested this work for loan and I said no because I've been planning this project around Tar Beach. So the day I arrived at the Guggenheim, which was almost 4 years ago, I almost heard immediately from the staff that everyone wanted to see this work on view. We did acquire this work, oh, forgive me, I forget exactly when, and we can come back to that detail, but it had never been on view in the museum, ever. Because it'd been on the road all that time, and there'd been some great Ringgold exhibitions and surveys around the country, and we're happy to lend. We are an institution that believes in lending and showing the work, unless we're showing it, of course. So it was the staff who said, we really, really, really want to see it on view, number one. Number two, we know that our website, the number one reason people come to our website is to look at our collection, and this is the fourth most visited work on our website. So the world is interested in this, and I was like, all right, I'm gonna do something with it. I know, of course, Faith Ringgold as someone who has been incredible in synthesizing a kind of language of painting and a language of craft. Going to quilting tradition, making story quilts that really look to a history of modernist painting as part of its foundation. And I wanted to then tell that story about what she looked toward, and as you rightly say, those who look to her. But I kind of wanted to reframe it a little bit. So in fact, one of the words that I always avoided in thinking about the artists who came before Faith Ringgold was the word influence. This is a show that pulls together European modernists, so I pulled out some Picassos, pulled even one in from Venice to put on the wall, Marc Chagall, as well. The work is called Tar Beach, and it features her signature character, Cassie Lightfoot, who can fly. She and her friend, Bibi. And of course, Marc Chagall is famous for these paintings with flying figures, and in many ways, the perspective by which Cassie and Bibi are presented is a kind of mirroring of what Chagall did. Tar Beach, it's a beach scene, right? What did the modernists love doing but painting beach scenes? So there's two Picasso beach scenes there as well. But instead of talking about how these artists influenced her, what I talked about was the rise of modernism in Europe, and how this was a moment where painters decided they weren't just going to paint the privileged, the rich, the aristocratic, but they were going to paint everyday people going on about their lives and their leisure and their business. And what Faith Ringgold realized was that the stories of Black people were just as important in that tradition of kind of vernacular and everyday life. And those could be part of art history as well. So that's what I talk about. Instead of talking about influence, it's more expansion, the expansion of history. But I also bring in some of the people who sort of worked alongside her as contemporaries, Jacob Lawrence, someone interested in narrative, the way Faith made story quilts. And so there's these characters of tragedy and comedy here. Also bringing in artists who were thinking about fabric traditions, Alan Shields, who you see there, Howardina Pendel's across from him in this room as well. And then I bring in these sort of younger heads, as we would call them, people who are also, again, interested in expanding the narratives that show up in art history and expanding this language of craft. So Shabalala Self, who, she almost cried when she heard she was in this exhibition together. Carrie Mae Weems thinking about new stories coming into art history. So these are the people sort of surrounding this exhibition.
So we're quickly running through our time, and I have more questions about this. And I should also say that the Faith Ringgold show that Andrew is curating here is about her children's book illustrations and all of the art that she made, original artworks for the children's books, including Tar Beach. And that opens June 27th, so we hope you'll put that on your calendars to come see here as well, in addition to going to New York and seeing Naomi's shows. But I did want to make sure that we talked a little bit about how you became who you are, your curator origin story. What were some of the kind of moments that led you here, your early experiences with museums and whatnot? What can you tell us about how you got here?
What can I tell you as we're running out of time? Well, I can tell you that I wanted to be a doctor, actually. So you are looking at a failed gynecologist and obstetrician. Yes. So I went to, I was a biology major for 3 years. I mean, it was totally pre-med. But going back to that moment of being the post-Black Power baby, I just grew up in a world that was, the world that the Black arts movement created. That there was never a moment where art was not constitutive of my life, whether it be literary, performance, dance, theater, visual arts. It was in the air, it was in the neighborhood. So even when I went to college, I was working in an art gallery, not thinking this was gonna be a career. It's just something you did, taking art history courses so that by the time I realized, I was like, I'm just not gonna be a doctor. I could go to grad school for art history because I had enough coursework even in me to actually start that. I also made a very specific decision to, through a little bit of process of elimination, but become a curator, and specifically a contemporary curator. I realized also that the thing I love the most about this world is the sociality of it and the community of it. And I love sitting and talking with artists. I mean, there is nothing better than just sitting at a bar and just, pardon my French, shooting the shit. And I may not always like what an artist make or what they produce, but I'm always, always fascinated in these sort of conversations. And so I wanted to be in a space where I was constantly in conversation with artists and helping to put their work into the world. And I also finally made a decision to work in institutions. I'm not a freelance curator. I don't do the hustle, I can't do the hustle, I need a little focus in my life. But I believe in museums because they are the institutions that also believe in sitting between the art and the artist and a public. And I don't think it's worth having all this art in the world if we can't offer it to the public, if we can't explain it to the public, if we can't have the public interacting with it. And so I very much believe that even with all their complications and all the issues that might come with institutions, that museums are so important as that kind of intermediary between a creative practice and a creative audience.
And so just to give the audience a little bit of perspective on the institutions that you've come through and kind of left your mark on, important early stint at the Studio Museum in Harlem, right? This was one of your first big shows there.
Yeah, Rushy was in that show, yeah. This is a show from 2008.
Yep. And then long time at your hometown institution, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago. Where you did this incredible Howardina Pindell exhibition that we were talking earlier. I got to see you speak on a panel like 10 years ago about this show, or maybe less than 10 years, but a while. And and I was very inspired by you, back then. But also say that these are three very different institutions, right? The Studio Museum, the MCA Chicago, and the Guggenheim. And I'd love to hear a little bit about how you've moved through all of those different institutional contexts and what's been different and what's been the same kind of across them.
Yeah, they're more alike than you think, but I would say the thing that makes them distinct is the Studio Museum is a culturally specific institution. So it is dedicated by mission to Black artists and Black culture. So it gives you a focus immediately. It's nice because it gives you parameters, and artists in general also like parameters, and so it's wonderful to kind of have a very specific mission and starting point. That said, of course, with that mission, which I of course share, I mean, this is my practice, and thank God that, again, I get this award, the Driskell Prize, that recognizes that this is the core of my mission. But the key also to the Studio Museum's mission was that even in that focus on Black culture and Black artists, you can be as capacious and global as you want to be. So it's parameters without narrowing your field of focus. And the MCA Chicago is a really interesting institution to have worked at, because it is one that is situated in a city with a lot of civic pride. And I think you all here in Atlanta can also relate to this. People in Chicago care for their institutions. Everybody's on the board, everyone's giving money, everyone's volunteering, everyone's visiting. It's incredible. So to do a show in Chicago is not just about a kind of a statement inside of one encapsulated place. It is a conversation with the city. It is a conversation with an entire neighborhood before the show even happens about why this is important. And it's incredible to build up what feels like a coalition around an artist or a project when you work in Chicago. And then you come to this sort of grand dame of, of a place like the Guggenheim. And the Guggenheim, though it is thought of as a sort of generalist institution from modern to contemporary, it too, though, has its kind of foci. It is very, very much kind of invested in what is the avant-garde sort of contemporary practice, who's at the leading edge of things, and how do we make this sort of story about our art history that can go back 100 years. And I love being able to do a show like this Faith Ringgold project because on the one hand, like many people, I'm obsessed with her from my childhood, reading books like Tar Beach. But on the other hand, I know I can go into an institution and make those connections that extend back 100 and 150 years with every artist in that space. But what they all share, though, that's really beautiful, is that they are all collecting institutions. And that, I think, is a particular thing. I don't think people understand enough the distinction between a non-collecting institution, one that we would call a Kunsthalle, and one that is a collecting institution. Because a collecting institution really does put the majority of their resources toward caring for that collection. And I mean people, money, all of that. It is about the holding of stories and the ability to tell stories again and again and again. That's really important. So when I work at these institutions, I'm not just working there to make exhibitions. I'm working to bring artists into the collection so that someone 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, will then be able to tell stories with those works and with those artists well into the future.
And another thing that when I was thinking about what might be different between these institutions is obviously the international profile of the Guggenheim and also of your work recently and into the future, right? So to this sense that you are incredibly prolific in ways that I'm just totally in awe of. I'm sure we all are. In addition to having 2 shows that opened this year and lots of other projects, I'm sure, in the works. For your home institution, you're going to be curating Documenta. You recently curated one part of an 8-venue Barbara Chase Rebut show in Paris. And I'm just interested in hearing you speak a little bit about bringing your vision abroad and working internationally.
Yeah. First of all, I just consider myself busy. I mean, if you want prolific, David Driskell's prolific, right? Kelly Jones is prolific. Deb Willis is prolific. Okay, I'm just busy. Just do a little show here and there. They just happen to happen at the same time. But it is true. I mean, first of all, I work at the Guggenheim, which is not one museum, it's 4. Yeah. And one of them is in startup mode. There's one here in New York, of course, one in Venice where it's able to snatch a Picasso away from, one in Bilbao, and then one in Abu Dhabi. And, there's a lot of early morning calls with the Middle East as we are literally building the collection and building the programs for that museum, and building the building for that matter. But it's also the case that I am soon to go part-time at the Guggenheim. Technically, I am already, because I also have an office in this building in the middle of Germany in a city called Kassel, where I am artistic director of the next Documenta. And this is an exhibition that kicks off every 5 years in this town in the middle of Germany, founded in the wake of World War II, where, well, we know what Germany did in World War II, and so part of its literal reparations was creating an international platform for arts and culture, and it is still, to this day, an incredibly important project for many artists who come to the city and really think about what's happening in the world at that moment. I'm the first American to do it. And I think it's significant that the first American is African American. I think that says something.
So Documenta has been going on since the immediate post-World War II period, or
Oh, yeah,
Oh
the
my
first one was
gosh.
1955.
Wow.
1955, and there were sort of things leading up to it before it was officially documented in 1955, but it's gone on every 5 years since then. And it's had, some of the curators I would have looked up to have done this project. So it was one where, as I said, I'm busy. When they first called, I said, no, thank you. And then they called back like, really? And I was like, you're right, I'm stupid, I can't pass this up. But before this even opens, I also have another project opening at the Palais de Tokyo this fall in Paris. I'm guest artistic director there for what they're calling their American season. And doing a show of Melvin Edwards and doing a show of artists who are inspired by French philosophy. But it's really important for me to think about my practice as global. And not for any kind of, immodest sense, not because I think I'm important, but again, it goes back to that kind of post-Black Power baby thing. I mean, it's the third time I'm saying it tonight. That Pan-Africanism part of my upbringing was very much about understanding myself as part of a global community. And a global community of people of African descent, but a global community of the entire world. And the world is my right? I have a right to be there. And it's also the case that I said before, I learned this from the Studio Museum. Your focus and your mission can start for something very specific. And in my case, I share that with the Studio Museum. It is the foregrounding and the pushing forward of Black artists and Black art history. But that also is a conceptual way of opening up so many stories about art and art history that I could tell about anyone. So this is really about Black thought, not just about Black people, and I'm happy to take Black thought globally.
Wow, yeah. So I think that is a powerful note for our conversation to turn into our conversation. Advance the slide for the QR code. I think there are already maybe a question or two. And please continue to put them into the queue. Ooh, this is a good one. What are your ambitions? Will Naomi Beckwith be a curator forever? Would you consider being a director of a museum? Or are there other trajectories that you can foresee?
Okay, so the day the day I started at the Studio Museum, Lowry Stokes Sims was the president, and I adore Lowry Stokes Sims. She is a brilliant curator, brilliant art historian, the first Black woman to curate at the Metropolitan Museum, and really someone I look toward as an icon, really, and a model. And Lowry used to say that there were three things she would never be. She would never be a wife, a mother, or a museum director. Oh. And I was like, I'm with you, girl. And then she became the head of the Studio Museum. And she said when that happened, as soon as that was announced, everyone called and asked when the wedding was. I don't know what it is, but I share exactly those instincts, but I did marry. So all this is to say life is long and you never know what it throws at you. But I asked Lowry, understanding her wish in the world, why she took up the mantle of the directorship of the Studio Museum. And she said, because I knew it was still part of my mission. And that's the core of what her work was as an art historian, but she also knew she could do that as a director. I have literally no ambitions to be a director. Nobody believes me when I say that, but I promise you, again, all I want to do is sit down and have a drink with artists. That is my only ambition. But if there's a way in which I can further the work that I need to do through leading an institution, okay, fine, but it would have to be the right one. Yeah. So I never say no to anything, not Documenta either, but there are no particular ambitions.
It's a fall within your mission. Somebody asked, why Rashid Johnson now? Like, what made you, there's so many deserving artists, I'm sure you have drinks with a lot of them, and what made that kind of rise to the top for you for this moment?
There were a couple things. One of them actually was a coincidental one, that Rashid actually had a long history with the Guggenheim. And so just coming out of Chicago, understanding the importance, as I said, of coalition building, I knew it'd be easy to kind of sell him to the Guggenheim in that way. But outside of that, Rashid and I call each other long-lost cousins.
Yeah.
And we like to say, and I said this even earlier to someone, that we talk about this show as being 2 years in the making, but 20 years in the making. I mean, we literally met 20 years ago, and we were basically are from the same place at the same time and had very similar concerns in our parallel practices, which were, of course, what are the stakes for Black artists now? What are the stakes for representation in art history? What are the stakes for a kind of conceptual practice that moves out of conceptualism into something that's more materially based? These are conversations that we've been having over many drinks over 20 years, and so it made sense for us to kind of share those concerns through this public outing of his work. One of the things that I learned with working with Howard Dean and Pendel too is that when you make a show of one artist, that show should never just be about what this artist did from day one to day whatever, 647. That show should be about a story of art history and how you want to inflect it. And that's what I meant when I said that David Driskell's gift was inflecting the stories of art history. I am not telling a story of Rashid through American art history. I'm telling the story the way he thinks about his life, through these conversations with poetry, through conversations with history, through conversations with his peers, through conversations about Black masculinity and the crisis and the beauty of all of this. And that's how I want to be able to tell stories in general, through specificities of cultural practices. And Rashid was just perfect for that, a perfect way to walk through the 21st century of art right now.
Sorry, I'm having trouble finding. Somebody wanted to know, or quite a few people want to know, about advice that you have for people pursuing curatorial careers, like and you know, how to go about it, what kinds of training, what kinds of actions one might take.
So people, when I was younger, I would have this really flat answer to like, how did you become a curator? And my answer, which is truthful, was I played football.
Oh.
And everyone looked at me like I was crazy. But it is true that when I moved to New York, almost immediately, I fell in with this group of folks who played football every weekend in Prospect Park. And it turns out most of them were artists. Now, that is not the only way I got to it, but what I mean to say is that this practice is social, especially if you're working with contemporary art. Now, if you're working with more historical art, we can get to that in a moment, but for someone interested in the contemporary art field, the most important thing you can do is have conversations with artists. I spoke to a woman yesterday who wants to start her own Kunsthalle. You know, she has ambitions to make a new art organization in New York, and I said, talk to artists. Ask them what they need, ask them what they want, ask them what they're thinking about, what they're doing. And so those football games were literally, the early part of the day was football, but later in the day was, again, all these social conversations about what's important for artists now. But of course, the second thing is just know your stuff. I did get an art history degree, right? Do that work, because it does two things for you. One, it allows you to have really informed conversations with those artists, because any good artist is looking to art history as much as they're looking toward their inner vision. Mm-hmm. And then secondly, it builds up a network, right? Your schoolmates are going to be your supporters as you move through the world. So I know it's expensive, and I know it can be a pain in the ass, but I do believe in some kind of formal training, or at least spend a lot of time by yourself in the library, no matter what.
Absolutely, and I just, to that end, I mean, once you get into a role curating, even if it's a junior role or, you know, and you eventually work your way up, you don't have time, right? You're not able to like lock yourself in the library or away with your books. So that period of schooling, or if it's like freestyle library time by yourself, like that's so important, because exhibition work is demanding, right?
It's all day, every day for years.
All right. People want to know about like your dream show, what other artists you look forward to curating, what, we know you're not going to give away all your secrets, but if you have something you want to share about dreams and future projects.
I'll tell you something I'm jealous about right now, and I told them that. Lorna Simpson has a show at the Met right now, and I'm really jealous. I mean, this is another artist who I would really love to sink my teeth into. And that time may come. That time may come. This is the other wonderful thing about this work is you can do it for a long time, and it's mental work. You may not be able to be on your feet all day in a museum for many years, but you can sort of write and think and co-curate with somebody who can be on their feet all day as you get up in age. So maybe, 10 years from now, there's a Lorna project or something. But there's always a group of artists who've helped me think through history. Adrian Piper is another one. Carrie Mae Weems is another. Christian Markley is another one. These are people who I return to again and again. Lamont Young, another one. They're just artists who kind of my mind gets to when I'm thinking about things, when I'm framing even arguments. And so those are the dreams, though one never knows. I also understand I tell this to artists, and I told this a lot to my peers when I was younger who were getting a little mad that I wasn't giving them shows. I'm like, look, shows take years to put together. I may love you and love your art, but I may never get to do a show with you. But I will try to find a way to support your practice. So even if I can't put you in an exhibition, I might write for your book. Or I might sit on a jury one day and put you in front of other curators and other writers and hopefully give you some money even. Yeah. It's my greatest joy to support artists, and a show isn't the only way to do that.
You're here. And speaking of the Lorna Simpson show, somebody points out this remarkable kind of simultaneity confluence of so many important Black artists on view right now in New York. Rashid, Amy Sherald, Lorna Simpson, and Tyler Mitchell, our very own Atlanta-born art star. So what are your thoughts on the scale of Black creativity at major New York museums all at one time?
I'm all for it, and long may it continue, right? Look, 4 shows, Saya Woolfolk's another one on view. 5 shows out of 200 actually isn't that many, right? So I also want to keep reminding people that this feels like a moment, but statistically speaking, we still have a lot of work to do, and I'm here for that work. Some of you may have also seen, I don't know how many of you read the New York Times, but there was this dastardly article that
wasn't going to bring it up.
That talked about exactly that phenomenon, but what they also pointed out were all these artists were showing at Hauser and Wirth. And so the article called this the Hauser Spring. And you can imagine I had thoughts about that. Kudos to Hauser and Wirth, but the implication was somehow that this new big mega gallery, not new, but whatever, this sort of large mega gallery that has made inroads from Switzerland across Europe and now into the United States is somehow propelling the careers of all these artists, not understanding, at least the article didn't understand, that all of these artists have been working for decades and have actually not only produced amazing work, but also have managed their careers in a way so that when the call came from a major institution, they were ready. So if anything, it's the inverse, that Hauser and Wirth actually saw the stars that were ascending in the world and got them all at the gallery, and hello, then there's a beautiful confluence of these constellation at these major museums all at once. And again, needs to keep happening, right? This shouldn't be the only moment.
Absolutely. All right, I think we're kind of at our time. I'm just looking for maybe one more question here. And okay. I always get asked this question, and I'm sorry, because when I get asked it, I'm like, now I'm going to pose it to you. So
Okay, let's see what I
inspiration
can
from
do with
you.
it, whatever it is.
What is your criteria for evaluating an artist's work? If good and bad are subjective, how do you cut through the noise to find a message worth sharing?
You know, a bad work can have a good message. So I agree that sometimes this question of good and bad is subjective, but I do believe you can start making these kind of judgments. I remember coming out of grad school and hearing people talk about good and bad work, and I'm like, how do you even assess that? And then I remember like 5 years later being like, that's crap, right? And so understanding that I had started to develop an eye. I think everything has a context. Right? And for me, when I'm talking to an artist or maybe coming to an artwork, the question is, can I see this in a context? Not necessarily can I build a show around it, but can I see the kind of working process of an artist? What do they want to do with this material? What do they want to do with this image? Who are they talking to in terms of other artists? I mean, I said it before, a good artist is a good art historian, usually. I mean, talking to Rashid is shameful for me. I mean, he could name people's practices down to what they were making year on year, right? So, or, you know, what is the world they were living in? And what does this work do to maybe expand my understanding of that world? Not foreclose it, but expand it. Those are the things that I am thinking about when I'm encountering an art. And I don't maybe sometimes think just about in terms of good and bad, though that does happen, but maybe kind of like usefulness. Does it make an aperture for me into the world?
Thank you, Naomi. Thank you all for joining us, for your great questions. It's just such a pleasure.
Pleasure is all mine, and
Yeah.
thank you all again. Thank you to the High Museum, and of course, you know, I want to honor, of course, the legacy of David Driskell. And if you don't mind, it just occurred to me now, I also want to hold up the name of Koyo Kuo, a curator that we just lost. This year, this document, of course, is so important for me. But one of the things that made it so important was that the year before, the Venice Biennial would have its first African woman as curator, and Koyo Kuo was to announce her ideas for the Venice Biennial next week, but tragically died suddenly about a week and a half ago. So I just want to hold her name up to the stars and thank her.